In 1916, a man named Frank Vanderlip gave an interview to the Saturday Evening Post. Frank Vanderlip was not a minor figure. He was the president of the largest bank in the United States. He had served as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury under President McKinley. He was one of the most powerful financial minds in American history. In that interview, he confessed something, and he described a secret meeting that had taken place 6 years earlier. He named the participants. He described the precautions they had taken to avoid being recognized. And then he wrote, in plain language, that if the public had known who had drafted the legislation being debated in Washington, the legislation would never have passed. That legislation was the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The meeting he described had taken place on a private island. I came to this story not through economics, but through a train schedule. On the night of November 22, 1910, a private railway car departed from a station in Hoboken, New Jersey. I want you to hold that image for a moment. Not a government building, not a Senate chamber, a railway car at night. The men who boarded it had been given specific instructions: travel alone, arrive at different times so as not to be seen together. Bring no luggage bearing your real initials. Use only first names or no names at all, for the duration of the trip. One of the participants later described the level of secrecy as something you might associate with men engaged in a great conspiracy. He used those words himself. These were not spies. They were not criminals in the conventional sense. They were a senator, 2 Treasury officials, 3 private bankers, and a German-born financier who understood something none of the others fully grasped yet. They were going to Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia, private property of the Jekyll Island Club, a retreat accessible only to invited members. J.P. Morgan was among its founders. And here is the thing that keeps me returning to this story. The Federal Reserve System, the institution that controls the money supply of the United States, that sets the interest rates affecting every mortgage, every business loan, every credit card in your wallet. That system was not designed by elected representatives in a committee room. It was designed in 9 days, on a private island, by men who would not give each other their real names. I spent months trying to understand how that was possible. What I found was not just a meeting, it was a pattern. To understand Jekyll Island, you first have to understand what October 1907 felt like, not as a historical date, as an experience. Banks across the country were failing, not quietly. Depositors formed lines on sidewalks in New York, Pittsburgh, Memphis, demanding their money. Banks couldn't pay them. The American financial system had no emergency mechanism, no central authority, no lender of last resort, nothing to stop the cascade. And then something extraordinary happened. One private citizen stepped in and stopped it. J.P. Morgan, not the government, not Congress, not the president, personally summoned the most powerful bankers in New York to his private library on East 36th Street. He locked the doors. He refused to let them leave until they agreed to pool their reserves and stabilize the system. It worked. The financial press called it heroic, and Morgan's allies in Washington understood something the newspapers did not report. If one private man could hold the American economy in his hands during a panic, then whoever institutionalized that function permanently would hold something larger than any elected office. Congress responded by creating the National Monetary Commission in 1908. Its mandate: study the problem and recommend a solution. Its chairman, Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, the most influential banking ally in the United States Senate. What the newspapers reported less prominently was this. Senator Aldrich's daughter had recently married John D. Rockefeller, Jr. The man appointed to design the new American banking system was family, not metaphorically, by law. Here's where the pattern begins to emerge. Senator Aldrich sent the invitations personally. 6 men, not 12, not a committee, 6. And the instructions were precise enough that each of them understood, without being told directly, that what they were about to do was not meant to be known. So who were they? Nelson Aldrich, Republican senator, chairman of the National Monetary Commission, the political architecture of the entire plan. A. Piatt Andrew, assistant secretary of the Treasury, the government's man in the room, present to provide the appearance of official sanction to a private gathering. Henry Pomeroy Davison, senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company, Morgan's personal representative. Morgan himself did not attend. He didn't need to. Benjamin Strong, head of Bankers Trust of New York. He would later become the first and arguably most powerful chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank of New York, the largest bank in America, built on capital from the Rockefeller family, the same family Senator Aldrich had married into. And finally, Paul Warburg, German-born, a partner at Kuhn Loeb and Company, the one man in that railway car who had actually studied how the Bank of England and the German Reichsbank operated, the architect. Together, by some estimates, these 6 men represented control over approximately 1/4 of the entire world's wealth. None of them had been elected to anything. None of them carried public authorization to draft monetary legislation. None of them were operating under any official commission. They were going to write the law in any way. Vanderlip himself confirmed this years later. In that Saturday Evening Post interview, and I want to be precise here because this is not speculation, he wrote that the secrecy was necessary because discovery would have been fatal to the plan. If it had been known that the bill had originated on Jekyll Island, Congress would never have passed it. He did not say this with shame. He said it as a matter of fact. That is the part I cannot stop thinking about. They stayed on Jekyll Island for 9 days. I find that number strange every time I return to it. 9 days to redesign the architecture of American money. Paul Warburg was the intellectual engine. He had spent years studying European central banking and understood something the American financial establishment desperately needed: how to build a central bank that appeared to be governmental, while remaining in its operational core, privately controlled. The political problem was real. Americans had rejected central banking twice before. Andrew Jackson had killed the second Bank of the United States in 1836. The memory was not abstract in 1910, it was a political warning. Any plan that resembled a central bank would be destroyed before it reached a vote. So Warburg proposed a structural disguise. They would not call it a central bank. They would call it a reserve system. They would divide it into 12 regional branches, creating the appearance of geographic decentralization. They would place a government-appointed board at the top, providing the appearance of public oversight. But the actual decisions, interest rates, money supply, credit expansion, and contraction would rest with the member banks, the banks that owned the system, the banks represented in that railway car. Sometimes I ask myself whether I am connecting things that were not meant to be connected, whether the timing is coincidental, whether these men simply happen to be the most qualified to solve a genuine problem, whether what looks like a design was really just pragmatism. But then I read what they wrote about it themselves, and the self-doubt becomes harder to maintain. The Jekyll Island draft had a name when it came out of that meeting, the Aldrich Plan, and it died immediately. Democrats in Congress recognized it for what it was: a banker's blueprint handed to a senator whose family had direct financial ties to the very institutions the plan would empower. They called it Wall Street legislation. They were not wrong. The Aldrich Plan never passed. Here is where the pattern becomes undeniable. The same legislation was reintroduced 2 years later. Different name, different sponsors, different framing. It was presented not as a gift to the banking industry, but as a reform, a democratic correction to the chaotic, unaccountable private banking system. It was sponsored by Carter Glass of Virginia and Robert Owen of Oklahoma. Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat elected explicitly on a platform of breaking monopolistic power, agreed to sign it. The men who had drafted the original plan on Jekyll Island watched from the background. Paul Warburg testified before Congress in its favor. Benjamin Strong was appointed to lead its most powerful regional branch. Frank Vanderlip's bank became a founding member. The Aldrich Plan had not died. It had changed its name, changed its sponsors, and waited. On December 23, 1913, 2 days before Christmas, after much of Congress had left Washington for the holiday recess, Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. Senator Aldrich, whose name had been stripped from the bill entirely, reportedly remarked that while the legislation was not precisely what he had wanted, it would accomplish, and I am using his reported words here, the same thing. He was not wrong about that either. The Federal Reserve is not a federal agency. I want to be careful here because this is where conversations like this one lose credibility, so I will use their records. In 1982, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in Lewis versus United States that Federal Reserve banks are not federal instrumentalities for the purposes of certain legal claims. The court found that they are instead privately owned entities. The Federal Reserve does not appear in the federal budget as an expenditure. The 12 regional Federal Reserve banks are structurally owned by their member banks, the private institutions they nominally regulate. The presidents of those regional banks are selected in part by those same member banks. When the Federal Reserve creates money, it does not draw from a government reserve. It creates it in the modern system digitally and loans it into existence at interest. The official Federal Reserve educational materials describe this openly. Most Americans have never read them. The Social Welfare History Project, in its documentation of the Federal Reserve's founding period, notes that the concentration of financial power that emerged from 1913 onward represented a structural shift away from the decentralized credit networks that had characterized American economic life before the Civil War. Not chaos into order, one kind of order into another. The guild-based, community-regulated, relationship-dependent financial systems of the 18th and early 19th centuries had their own logic, their own fairness mechanisms, their own accountability structures. They also did not require at any point in a transaction that money pass through an institution none of the participants had elected. That changed in 1913, and the men who changed it had agreed not to use each other as names. I keep returning to Frank Vanderlip's Saturday Evening Post confession, not because it proves something sinister, because it proves something simpler and stranger. The men who designed the American monetary system knew that if the public had seen the design process, then the public would have rejected the design. They were right, and so they made sure the public wouldn't see it. Consider what that requires you to believe about everything that followed. Every interest rate decision since 1913, every recession, every expansion, every moment when credit tightened and small businesses closed and families lost homes, all of it flowing from an architecture designed in 9 days on a private island by men who had agreed not to acknowledge each other in public. Why did the Aldrich Plan fail in Congress, but pass 2 years later under a different name, with the same authors working from the background? Why did Frank Vanderlip wait until 1916 to admit what had happened on Jekyll Island, France, 3 years after the law was already signed? Why does the Federal Reserve, a century after its founding, still conduct no full public audit of its operations, despite legislation attempting to mandate one passing the House of Representatives multiple times? Why did Woodrow Wilson, who had campaigned against concentrated financial power, sign the bill that concentrated it most completely in American history? I don't have answers, only patterns. And the men on that train knew something we were never supposed to know. Whether they knew we would eventually find out is a different question entirely.